I will not shrink myself anymore. Not for money, not for nostalgia, not for a family that uses my kindness as a currency. My phone buzzed just as I was finishing my morning coffee. The mug was warm in my hands, the house quiet except for the low hum of the fridge and the faint tick of the wall clock. Outside, autumn light fell through the kitchen window, that soft, forgiving kind that makes even the tired feel slightly forgiven. The message came from my sister again. Mom's planning her 70th. Big family dinner. She wants you to host. You know how she loves your house. There was no, how are you? No, can you manage? Just the same old expectation dressed up as tradition. I stared at the screen for a long minute before setting the phone face down on the counter. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from a small, well-trained reflex. The one that always whispered, "Say yes, don't make trouble." It used to be so easy to obey that voice. But lately, I'd been waking up earlier. Not to please anyone, just because my mind refused to go quiet. I'd sit by the window, watching the street come alive, and think about the years I'd traded for peace that never came. The favors, the loans, the endless smoothing over. I could measure my adult life in the number of times I said, of course, when I meant no. Now, in my mid-40s, my son in college, my savings barely intact, I'd started to wonder what exactly I'd been buying with all that compliance. The text sat on the counter, the words still glowing faintly through the screen, demanding attention. I knew the script by heart. I'd host, I'd cook, I'd manage everyone's moods. I'd spend days pretending the family was something it hadn't been for decades, functional, affectionate, normal. Last year's dinner had ended with Mom crying and my brother shouting about how Marian always makes everything about herself. And I just smiled through it, like I always did. But something had shifted since then. Maybe it was the quietness of living alone. Maybe it was the therapy sessions I'd half-mocked before they started making too much sense. Or maybe it was the letter from my accountant, the one reminding me that my temporary help to my brother had quietly turned into a long-term debt I'd never agreed to. Whatever it was, I felt the resistance rise in me, small but real. Like a muscle that hadn't been used in years, but still remembered its purpose. I picked up the phone again, scrolled to the end of my sister's message, and typed 3 words that made my heart beat faster than they should have. I can't host. I didn't explain, didn't apologize. I just sent it. The silence that followed was louder than any argument. I stood there in my kitchen, watching the leaves scatter outside the window, and realized something unsettling. I didn't feel guilty. Not yet. Maybe that would come later, maybe it wouldn't. But in that moment, the air felt a little clearer, the light a little brighter. It was such a small thing, really, one text. But it felt like the first real decision I'd made in years. I didn't know then that this tiny rebellion would set off everything that came next, the accusations, the legal letters, the days I'd wish I could take it all back. But standing there, with the taste of coffee still on my tongue and the echo of my own courage buzzing through me, I felt something close to freedom. Something that, once found, would not let me go. When I was little, I learned that love was something you earned by being useful. In our house, that meant doing the invisible things, setting the table before anyone asked, remembering everyone's birthdays, soothing Mom when she cried about how tired she was. I was the good one. My brother was the brilliant one. My sister was the pretty one. The categories were fixed long before we learned to question them. I never wanted to be difficult. Difficult girls were called selfish. So I became easy, the kind of child who apologized even when she didn't know what she'd done wrong. That habit grew legs and followed me into adulthood. In my 20s, it looked like volunteering for extra shifts at work because my boss counted on me. In my 30s, it looked like lending my brother money just until the end of the month. By my 40s, it had turned into quietly managing other people's chaos while convincing myself it was just family loyalty. Sometimes I think about how subtle it all was. There was never a moment when someone said, "Marianne, you must sacrifice yourself now." It was always smaller, a tone, a sigh, a phrase like "you're so good with these things." It's strange how manipulation can sound like flattery. Mom used to say, "Your brother means well, he's just under pressure," whenever he snapped or forgot to pay me back. I'd nod and smile, because what else was there to do? Arguing only made me feel like a bad daughter. But deep down, resentment began to calcify, quiet, unexpressed, sitting under my ribs like a stone. When I got married, I thought I'd escaped it. My husband, Daniel, was kind at first, calm, reassuring. He liked how capable I was, how I kept everything running. But even he began to rely on that same invisible machinery, the unpaid labor of making everyone else comfortable. By the time he left, our house was spotless and our conversations were empty. He said he needed space to grow. I said nothing, because by then silence was second nature. Now, years later, I can trace every one of those patterns like the lines on my own hands. Each favor, each swallowed argument, each time I stayed quiet when I should have screamed, all part of a choreography I never chose. The family didn't notice, of course. They never do. To them, I'm just Mary Ann, the dependable one. The one who answers calls in the middle of the night, who remembers the insurance forms, who somehow always knows where everyone's birth certificates are. I once thought being indispensable meant being loved. Now I know it only means being convenient. The day after I told my sister I couldn't host, she called. Her voice was bright, brittle. "Marianne, are you feeling okay? You sounded off in your text." I wanted to say, "I'm fine. I'm just tired of performing servitude as family bonding." But I didn't. Old habits die hard. Instead, I said, "I'm okay. I just have a lot going on." There was a pause, the kind filled with judgment disguised as concern. "You've always been a bit sensitive about these things," she said. "Mom just wants to feel loved." I almost laughed. Mom had always been loved. It just never seemed to satisfy her. After the call ended, I sat in the same kitchen as before, phone on the counter, heart drumming slow and steady. Something in me whispered, "Don't walk this back." For once, I listened. Because deep down, I knew this wasn't just about a dinner. It was about every dinner, every favor, every time I made myself smaller so others could stay comfortable. And though I couldn't yet see where it would lead, I knew that saying no had already begun to rewrite my entire story. I spent 3 days planning that dinner like it was a small rebellion. I cleaned every surface until the house looked like a place you could breathe in, not just survive in. I ironed tablecloths I hadn't used in years, arranged mismatched candles into a centerpiece that somehow felt tender instead of twee, and made a playlist of songs Mom liked when she wasn't feeling dramatic old jazz, a bit of Edith Piaf, some light Motown. I even baked a tart from a recipe my grandmother used to make, the one with a flaky crust that never turned out quite right but tasted like memory when it did. My son, Thomas, helped where he could. He's at college now, with an exam schedule and a life that mostly happens elsewhere, but he folded napkins like he remembered how to care. At one point, he looked up at me and said, "You're doing too much." I smiled and told him it was fine. I wanted Mom to sit at that table and feel loved in a way that didn't feel transactional. I wanted someone, anyone, to see the work I put into keeping the seams from bursting. The night arrived. I lit the candles, put the tart on the center of the table, and waited. My sister came, late, with a laugh that sounded like a paper balloon. She had an excuse about traffic and a story about how Mom had changed her outfit 3 times. My brother showed up half an hour after that, red-faced and slightly tipsy, with a gift card shoved in his pocket like it was a joke. He greeted me like I'd been an extra they'd begrudgingly hired for the evening. Mom sat at the head of the table and, for a few minutes, it felt like the old movies, laughter, clinking glasses, the soft clatter of plates. Then conversation shifted. My brother started complaining about work, and my sister moved the subject to a mutual friend's wedding. Mom, who had been in good spirits, grew quieter. At some point she glanced at me and said, "It's nice that Marian always takes care of these things." It was meant to be a compliment. It landed like a verdict. Halfway through the tart, my sister's phone buzzed. She stood, apologetic, and left the room to take the call. My brother, increasingly impatient, announced he had to get home to check on something and left without saying goodbye. Mom slipped out to her bedroom and fell asleep before dessert was finished. Thomas tried to keep the conversation alive, asking stories about family heirlooms, about aunts and uncles everyone seemed to forget existed. His questions were met with shrugs and polite, surface-level anecdotes. I sat at the table and watched the evening unravel like cheap string. The little rituals I'd prepared, the playlist cued just so, the tart placed center stage, the napkins folded with care, didn't hold anything sacred. They were background, easily dismissed. I felt the familiar twinge of embarrassment for having expected that my labor would change anything. When it was over, the house was quiet in a hollower way than before. I cleared plates alone, my hands moving through motions that felt both automatic and newly defiant. Thomas helped with the washing up, and on the sink side of the kitchen, he finally said what I had been afraid to hear aloud. She was there, Mom was there, but it wasn't enough. You can't make them want to be better. He was right, of course. No tart, no playlist, no hours of cleaning could coax an increase of compassion out of people who'd been practicing indifference their entire lives. That night, I lay awake longer than I usually do, thinking about the way the family treated small kindnesses as though they were unlimited resources, something I could draw on forever without consequence. By morning, the hurt had calcified into something clearer. This dinner hadn't been a failure because of one night gone wrong. It had been a demonstration. The family had shown, in small, ordinary ways, exactly how little they were willing to change. I had invited them into my house, and they'd offered me their usual script: gratitude in public, entitlement in private. I knew then that if anything was going to be different, I'd have to stop relying on performance to earn respect. It was time to make a different kind of account, one that couldn't be erased with a shrug. The anonymous envelope came without warning. It was tucked behind a jar of dried lavender by a hand that assumed I would find it in the cadence of my afternoons. Inside were printed emails, routing numbers, meeting notes, lines I could follow like a trail through brush. Someone inside had watched and risked exposure. The line at the bottom: find the root, prune the rot, read like an invocation. The paper showed Victor, in memos, instructing a vendor to adjust routing, and a finance update that hinted funds had been funneled through the custodian's accounts as part of stability measures. The documents did not shout. They whispered in forensic language. Marcus examined the printouts and said, "This is good, but fragile. Chain of custody is everything. If we leak now without structure, we give him grounds to claim defamation." We organized carefully. Lily scanned documents into an encrypted drive. Paolo, an ex-auditor with a patient manner, matched timestamps and vendor receipts until the list of transactions formed a clear line. Maya, the journalist who believed in slow truths, advised on how we might place information publicly without betraying sources. We were deliberate. Revenge requires evidence and restraint in equal measure. There are ways to be brave that are not bravado. The anonymous sender had been brave. Our work going forward was to be brave methodically. Collect, corroborate, protect informants, and move as if we were surgeons at a long table. I discovered in myself a new patience, a careful hunger that preferred accuracy to spectacle. I hit send and felt the odd, vertiginous mixture of relief and fear. Sending that list felt like stripping the glamour off decades of doing what I thought was love. It felt like turning a private accounting into a public document. I wasn't demanding interest. I was demanding acknowledgement. The reply came quicker than I expected and colder than I imagined. Seriously? You're going to keep score now? After everything I've done for this family? Do you know how hard things are for me? There was the indignation, packaged as moral outrage. I read it and felt the old reflex kick in, the one that said enough for everyone is never enough for you. My hands hovered over the keyboard. For a beat, I wanted to soften it, to apologize, to say that I understood his pressure. But the ledger was still open on my screen, and the faces of moments where I'd swallowed my own needs stared back at me. Instead, I typed, I know it's hard. I also know I'm not an ATM. Help me help you by committing to repayment. No more open-ended promises. That was the symbolic act I couldn't take back, not the refusal itself, but the demand for a written promise. It changed the terms from emotional blackmail to contractual expectation. For them, it was an affront. For me, it was a boundary finally given a shape. My brother sent 2 more messages, the second one less reasoned, the third full of passive aggression about how I'd always kept scores. My sister called and said I was making things worse, that Mom would be hurt. Mom herself called later, voice small and tired, saying she didn't want fuss. The family lined up like a chorus, each vocalizing the same theme. Marian had to be reasonable, accommodating, the one to smooth the edges. They wanted to make my refusal a problem I could be shamed out of solving. But that ledger on my screen tasted like a small revolution. It said in numbers what my heart had been whispering for years, that my patience, my money, my time were not infinite, that they deserved recognition and boundaries. I locked my phone and walked to the window. The afternoon light was thin, the kind that makes everything appear more honest. For the first time in a long while, the cost of saying no felt less terrifying than the cost of saying yes. I used to think rebellion had to roar, that the only way to be taken seriously was to make a spectacle, to yell until my throat burned and my hands shook. But by the time I turned 42, I'd learned a different language of defiance. Quiet rebellion, careful rebellion, one that could not be co-opted or trivialized. Months ago, I began the work no one noticed. I organized my finances in a way that made sudden demands irrelevant. Each bill paid, each insurance form filed, each minor investment accounted for felt like a small victory. I built a buffer not just of money, but of rules and routines that made me unassailable. My independence was no longer theoretical, it was structured, deliberate. I had a friend, Lena, who understood without needing explanations. She never asked me to dramatize my struggles. She'd drop by with coffee or cookies, and we'd sift through papers on my kitchen table as if we were plotting a secret garden rather than preparing for confrontation. "They think fear will work," she said once, smiling over a stack of receipts, "but you've already done the work they can't touch." And she was right. Even my home became a fortress of intention. Locks were inspected, backup keys hidden in clever places. The emergency numbers I'd memorized were no longer a casual precaution, but a lifeline in my pocket, my bag, my mind. I rearranged rooms to optimize both comfort and security, small changes that felt radical. A chair moved to block a hallway, documents stored in a fireproof box in plain sight. I was meticulous, almost ritualistic, and every act felt like reclaiming ground I'd lost in childhood. Most importantly, I practiced silence. I rehearsed conversations in my head where I would respond firmly but calmly. I had no need for shouting. My words, my gestures, my presence alone would be enough. And I had the most important witness to all of this, the person I fiercely protected, my niece Clara. She noticed the shift in me, subtle as a shadow moving across the wall. She didn't comment, she just felt safer, and that was my quiet triumph. I was building armor nobody could see but me, and for the first time in my life, I felt the intoxicating weight of preparation. It wasn't about revenge, it was about survival and dignity. And for the first time, I realized I didn't need anyone's approval. Not family, not old patterns, not the echoes of my own self-doubt. I had already chosen to protect what mattered, and that choice alone was radical. The knock came early in the morning, when the sun was still stretching its fingers over the rooftops. My first instinct was to freeze. Old patterns flared up, that reflexive urge to accommodate, to smooth, to disappear. But the training of the last few months, the quiet rebellion, was already in my muscles. I didn't freeze. I exhaled, slow and steady, and walked to the door. Through the peephole, I saw them, my family, the people who had built their expectations of me like a blueprint for exploitation. They stood there, confident, entitled. Their smiles were sharp, calculated, as if warmth could mask the weight of their demands. I could feel Clara behind me, peeking around the corner, her small hand finding mine. I squeezed it, not for reassurance, but to anchor her to reality. This was not a moment for fear. I opened the door. "Good morning," I said, my voice calm, controlled. My calmness was my first line of defense. Their eyes flicked over the apartment, taking in the subtle signs of my preparedness. The neatly stacked papers on the counter, the closed cabinet doors, the way the furniture subtly divided the space. It wasn't much, but it was enough to signal that I was not vulnerable. They started with small talk, testing, probing. "We were worried about you," one of them said. I nodded politely, letting the words wash over me like water on stone. I had anticipated this tactic. The false concern meant to weaken me, to make me question whether my boundaries were cruel. I had already decided my answer. My boundaries weren't cruel, they were necessary. Then came the questions, the demands disguised as casual conversation. Money, time, compliance, access. I could hear Clara shifting behind me, and I caught her eye. She needed me to hold the line. I felt the familiar old tug of guilt, the kind that used to tie me into knots, but I ignored it. Every demand was cataloged in my mind, filed with precision, ready for later use if needed. When the first push came, "You don't want to leave us out in the cold, do you?" I stepped aside, letting them enter the threshold of my apartment, but no further. I didn't invite them in. My body was the first boundary. "No," I said simply, "I won't." No explanation. No negotiation. Just the flat, undeniable truth. Their faces flickered. Shock, disbelief, then irritation. They tried to gaslight, to twist history, to imply that I had always been the problem. But I had spent months rehearsing. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I reminded them of small facts, calmly, firmly, emails, receipts, messages, all the invisible scaffolding of my independence. They tried one more tactic, leaning on Clara, coaxing, questioning. I stepped forward, between them and her, my hand gently on her shoulder. "Clara's safe," I said, and in that moment I realized something I had always known but never let myself feel fully. Protecting her was my power, and nothing they did could take that away. The door frame became a symbolic line. On one side, my family, bristling with entitlement and expectation. On the other, me, standing steady, immovable, fortified by months of preparation, clarity, and quiet determination. Every old fear, every childhood humiliation, every small compromise that had once defined me, none of it mattered now. I was fully present, fully myself, fully unwilling to shrink. They left hours later, frustrated but intact. I closed the door slowly, making sure every lock clicked. Clara hugged me, and for a moment I let myself feel relief, not triumph, not victory, just the steady, quiet certainty that we had survived. That survival, and the dignity with which we claimed it, was enough. For now. And yet, as I walked to the kitchen to pour myself a glass of water, I felt the echo of the confrontation settle into my bones. This was only the beginning. There would be follow-ups, pressure, tests, but now I knew I could hold the line. And I would. Quiet rebellion had become unshakable resolve. The phone rang mid-morning, the shrill sound slicing through the fragile calm I had carved out after the confrontation. I recognized the number immediately. It was social services. My stomach tightened, a reflex older than my conscious memory, but I breathed, slow and deliberate. I had prepared for this, meticulously, silently. Yet preparation does not erase anxiety entirely. "They've reported you," the voice on the line said, neutral but firm. "Concerns about your niece's welfare. We need to schedule a visit." I felt the weight of it immediately, not just the procedural obligation, but the invisible hands of my family pushing from behind the scene. This was no accident. It was weaponized love. Their affection, the kind that had been used to bind me, now masqueraded as concern to threaten me, to test my limits. I hung up and walked through my apartment like I was inspecting a fortress under siege. Every document in order. Every emergency number memorized. Receipts for every purchase relevant to Clara's care filed in neat stacks. Notes about her routines, her health, her school records, all double-checked. I wasn't just preparing for a visit. I was preparing for war conducted in silence and forms. The day of the visit arrived. The social worker, a competent woman in her 40s, introduced herself with a professional warmth. I smiled politely, gesturing Clara to a chair. My niece sat beside me, fidgeting slightly, a bundle of innocence and trust. The social worker asked questions with careful neutrality, her clipboard a shield as much as a tool. "Can you describe Clara's daily routine?" she asked. I spoke clearly, concisely, every detail documented, every answer rehearsed, but not robotic. Clara chimed in with her own perspective at times, proud to be heard. She had no idea she was demonstrating my competence by simply being herself, but I felt a surge of protective pride. Then came the subtle tests. Questions about meals, discipline, education, emotional support. Questions that could be twisted by someone looking for fault. I answered each calmly, citing records, routines, and small notes I had kept over months. Every detail mattered. Every small act of diligence became a shield against the insinuations waiting to be launched by my family. Halfway through, the social worker paused, pen hovering over her clipboard. "You seem very prepared," she said. There was no judgment in her voice, only observation. I nodded, a small, private smile crossing my lips. Preparedness was not arrogance, it was survival. I could feel the ghosts of old guilt creeping at the edges, the whispers of childhood obligation. Be polite, don't upset anyone, don't make waves. But now I recognized them as echoes, not commands. My boundaries were not just defensive, they were declarative. I refused to be diminished. When the social worker left, she left with a polite handshake and a folder of notes. I watched her go, then turned to Clara. "See? Everything is fine," I said softly, ruffling her hair. She smiled, oblivious to the politics that had surrounded her care, but fully aware of the safety she felt in our little apartment. Later, I sat with Lena, recounting the visit. We laughed, briefly, at the absurdity of how love could be twisted into leverage, how people could weaponize concern to control another's life. But the laughter was tempered by seriousness. I knew there would be follow-ups, perhaps even legal threats. My family's tactics were escalating. Yet in that escalation, I also saw clarity. The more they pushed, the more visible my strength became. Weaponized love was exhausting. It was infuriating. It was invasive. But it was also, in a strange way, a confirmation of my progress. They had no power to hurt me unless I allowed them, and I had spent months building a life where their influence ended at my doorstep. I had documents. I had friends. I had clarity. And most importantly, I had the quiet, unassailable knowledge that I was protecting the person I loved most, with dignity intact. That night, I sat by the window, Clara asleep in the next room, and I realized battles fought in silence, with preparation and resolve, could leave scars unseen but victories undeniable. This was no cinematic triumph. This was the quiet, painstaking, unglamorous triumph of survival, and it was worth every careful step I had taken. The next days were a blur of calls, emails, and small, deliberate meetings. I realized quickly that facing my family's weaponized love alone would be like trying to hold back a tide with bare hands. I needed allies. Not drama, not sympathy, real people who understood the stakes and could act with competence and discretion. Lena was the first. She had been there all along, a quiet observer, a co-conspirator in the art of preparation. But now she became strategist. We mapped out timelines, identified weak points, and rehearsed possible questions or accusations that might be leveled against me. She never suggested retaliation, only clarity and evidence. "You're not fighting them," she reminded me one evening over tea. You're defending the life you've built. There's a difference. Then came the professional allies. A lawyer specializing in family disputes who listened without judgment, asking precise questions that cut to the core: documentation, communications, financial records, witness testimony. I brought every note I had meticulously kept: the emails, the text messages, the informal agreements, the receipts. Each small piece of evidence, insignificant alone, became part of a mosaic that revealed my family's repeated pattern of entitlement and manipulation. Friends stepped in, too, not just for moral support, but practical aid. One helped me organize records into a coherent system. Another offered to sit in informal meetings as a witness to my routines with Clara. Each ally added weight to my defense, reinforcing what I already knew: I was not alone, and my life did not have to be compromised to satisfy their whims. It was an unusual coalition, bound not by sentiment but by principle. People I had known casually became integral. People I had trusted loosely became pillars. I noticed how small acts of solidarity could shift the atmosphere of anxiety to one of empowerment. One evening, Lena and I went through Clara's daily schedule, noting every small nuance: bedtime rituals, favorite snacks, homework routines. Nothing dramatic. Nothing spectacular. Just life, lived carefully and attentively. But these small acts, documented and supported, became evidence of competence, love, and stability. The preparation became almost ritualistic. Each day I checked boxes: correspondence logged, deadlines met, allies updated. Each night I reflected, documenting what had been done and anticipating what might come next. I felt a strange satisfaction in this meticulousness. Unlike my family, who thrived on chaos and emotional leverage, I thrived on clarity and order. By the time the next scheduled social services visit came, I was ready, not anxious, not defensive, but anchored. I had allies who could corroborate every claim, every routine, every careful decision I had made. I realized that what my family considered weakness, the deliberate, patient preparation, was actually a hidden strength. The more subtle and unassuming my defenses, the more unassailable they became. And yet, despite the practical strategy, there was an emotional shift I hadn't anticipated. I began to feel a quiet pride that wasn't tied to performance or approval. It was a pride born from resilience, from creating a network of trust that respected boundaries, intelligence, and love. I was no longer isolated in my struggle. My small, intentional rebellion had grown into a community of careful, competent solidarity. That night, I sat in the living room, Clara asleep, documents stacked neatly beside me, and Lena chatting quietly in the kitchen. I realized the lesson of allies: it's not just who shows up, it's how they show up. Presence, accuracy, discretion. That is power. That is protection. That is the quiet triumph that comes before the world notices, before the confrontation even reaches its peak. For the first time, I could feel the future stretching forward, not as a series of threats, but as a structure I had built, brick by brick, with people who chose to stand with me. My family's manipulations could knock at my door, they could send letters, they could whisper accusations, but the walls I had constructed, both physical and social, were now filled with allies, and I was no longer afraid. The morning of the official visit arrived like a quiet storm. I had prepared for every eventuality: the questions, the pauses, the subtle judgments that could be hidden behind neutral tones. My apartment smelled faintly of coffee and lavender. The curtains were drawn just enough to let in light without exposing too much. Clara was calm, brushing her hair at the kitchen table, her little rituals grounding both of us. I had rehearsed this scene countless times in my mind, but the anticipation still tightened my chest. The social worker arrived punctually, clipboard in hand, professional and courteous. She introduced herself formally, then settled into a rhythm of observation and questioning. I guided Clara to a chair beside me, noting her reactions and helping her feel secure. Every movement was deliberate but natural, Nothing staged, nothing exaggerated. I had learned the hard way that authenticity was the strongest defense. The questions began gently, almost conversationally. "Tell me about Clara's daily routine," the social worker said. I described it in detail: school hours, homework, meals, evening rituals, moments of play, times of reflection. Clara added a few notes herself, proudly correcting small errors in my account, and I felt a surge of protective pride. She was participating, but without coercion. She was a witness to her own life, just as I was. Then came the subtler tests. How do you handle disagreements? What happens if Clara gets hurt or upset? Each question had the potential to be twisted, to create doubt. I answered carefully, citing recent examples and established routines. I noted how I documented any incidents, how I communicated openly with teachers, and how I ensured Clara's voice was always heard. My answers were calm, precise, and grounded in evidence, not emotion. At one point, the social worker asked, "Have there been any challenges with family interactions?" Clara looked at me, eyes wide but trusting. I took a breath and answered honestly but neutrally, focusing on facts: visits, communications, expectations, and my boundaries. I emphasized the stability, consistency, and emotional care I provided, without demonizing anyone. The professional noted details on her clipboard, her expression neutral but attentive. As the visit progressed, I felt a shift. The tension that had gripped me in the past months, the fear of judgment, the anxiety of scrutiny, began to loosen. Each careful answer, each piece of evidence, each moment of calm control reinforced my confidence. The social worker occasionally glanced at Clara, who spoke with an innocence that contrasted sharply with the manipulations my family had attempted to engineer. I realized then that Clara's own presence was a quiet testimony to my care. When the social worker finally left, she did so with a firm handshake and a polite comment about thoroughness. I exhaled deeply, feeling the adrenaline drain from my body. I glanced at Clara, who smiled sleepily from the couch, and I felt a wave of relief so profound it almost surprised me. The visit had gone as I had meticulously prepared, and yet it had exceeded my own expectations in its quiet affirmation of our life together. Later, I sat with Lena, recounting the visit in detail, noting every observation, every question, every reaction. We logged the experience, stored the notes, and prepared for potential follow-ups. But there was also laughter, light and genuine, because for the first time in months, I felt the invisible weight of my family's manipulation lift, if only slightly. The lesson was clear: preparation, patience, and authenticity were powerful allies. The visit had not been a spectacle, a drama, or a confrontation. It had been a careful, deliberate demonstration of competence and care. And in that, I found not just relief, but quiet triumph. The fortress I had built with allies, evidence, and deliberate calm had held. And for the first time, I believed that nothing, not entitlement, not fear, not manipulation, could shake the ground beneath me. The court date was set for a late Thursday morning, the kind of day that presses in with gray light and low, expectant humidity. I arrived early, carrying a folder thicker than I had ever imagined necessary. Every email, every text, every note about Clara's routines, every receipt, every minor incident meticulously documented over months. Each page was a small victory, a testament to preparation, and a shield against the chaos my family might try to manufacture. I sat quietly in the waiting area, observing the other parents and guardians, some tense, some casual. My hands rested on the folder, fingers tracing the edges, a grounding ritual. Lena sat beside me, eyes calm but vigilant. She had reviewed every page with me, rehearsed possible cross-examination questions, and offered moral support that carried the weight of experience. "They can't argue with facts," she said softly, and I repeated it like a mantra. When the hearing began, I was called to present first. Standing in front of the judge, I felt the familiar twinge of old anxiety, the reflexive fear of scrutiny, of judgment, of not being enough, but it passed quickly. I had spent months transforming fear into methodical preparedness. I took a deep breath and began. Each point was laid out clearly. My role in Clara's daily life, my routines, my attentiveness to her emotional and physical needs. I presented the records systematically, referencing dates and times, quoting messages where necessary. Every piece of documentation reinforced the pattern of competence and care I had built. The judge listened attentively, occasionally flipping through the folder, nodding at the precision and clarity. Then came the cross-examination, conducted with clinical detachment by the family's attorney. They attempted to frame omissions, small oversights, even my insistence on boundaries as faults. But I had anticipated every angle. Each question was met with calm, documented responses. I showed emails where requests for money or favors were made, text threads revealing manipulative tones, and receipts proving independence. I remained composed, measured, and unshakable. At one point, my family tried to appeal to emotion, weaving stories of past sacrifices and expectations. I allowed them to speak, letting their words fill the room without interruption. Then, gently, I returned to the facts, clear, indisputable, grounded in evidence. The contrast between their dramatics and my calm clarity was palpable. Even Clara's occasional interjections, innocent, unprompted remarks about her routines or preferences, underscored my competence without any need for embellishment. By the end of the session, it was clear who had prepared and who had relied on entitlement and assumptions. The judge's questions were precise, measured, sometimes quietly testing the boundaries, but my documentation left little room for doubt. I felt a deep sense of relief, but also a quiet pride that this victory, small as it might appear to an outsider, had been painstakingly earned. As we left the courtroom, Lena nudged my shoulder. "They can't argue with this," she said. I nodded, feeling the weight of months of careful work finally pay off. My family's expectations, manipulations, and silent pressures had been countered not with anger, not with theatrics, but with patience, method, and evidence. That evening, alone in the apartment with Clara asleep, I reviewed the folder one last time before filing it in the cabinet. Each page represented not just proof, but a statement. I would no longer shrink. I would no longer acquiesce. I had documented my life, my care, my competence, and in doing so, I had drawn a line that could not be crossed. It wasn't a cinematic triumph. No one would write about it in glowing headlines. But it was real, concrete, irrevocable in its quiet insistence. And for the first time in decades, I felt the exhilarating clarity of being unassailable, not through force, but through deliberate, patient, unflinching care for the person I loved most. The day after the hearing, the apartment felt unusually quiet. The kind of quiet that isn't peace exactly, but the settling of dust after a storm. Clara played with her blocks in the corner, humming to herself, blissfully unaware of the intricate web of preparation, confrontation, and documentation that had kept her safe. I watched her, feeling a complex mix of relief, exhaustion, and loneliness. Victory had a strange, solitary taste. News of the hearing traveled through our family like a subtle tremor. There were phone calls I ignored, texts left unread, thinly veiled accusations disguised as concern. Some relatives leaned on mutual acquaintances, hoping gossip might sway public opinion or shame me into compliance. I let it roll off like water on oil. Their frustration was a confirmation of the line I had drawn, not a threat. Financially, there were ripples, too. A few small investments I had made to safeguard independence now needed attention after the abrupt interruptions of court preparations. There was paperwork to reorganize, bills to reconcile, and a nagging sense that life's practicalities never paused for emotional triumph. I handled it all slowly, deliberately, reminding myself that rebuilding was part of the process. Clara, sensing the tension, grew quiet at times, but I made small adjustments to ease her through. I started a new ritual, nightly storytelling that wasn't about moral lessons or family history, but about the mundane joys of our life together. These moments, ordinary and steady, became a thread of continuity amidst the upheaval and a reminder of what mattered most. Socially, I felt both liberated and isolated. Friends rallied, curious colleagues offered quiet support, but the absence of some family members' approval left a tangible gap. It stung occasionally, that echo of childhood longing for validation. Yet, each pang was tempered by clarity. Approval is optional. Presence is earned. Love is not a demand, it's a choice. Practical problems required attention, too. Household repairs delayed by court preparations, rescheduling appointments, and managing everyday chaos reminded me that life isn't paused for justice or clarity. But for the first time, I approached these tasks without fear of obligation or manipulation. I made choices grounded in my needs and priorities, rather than in someone else's entitlement. I also faced subtle social consequences. Some mutual acquaintances distanced themselves, unsure how to navigate our family's fractures. Others, however, stepped closer, curious and impressed by the quiet strength we had shown. These shifting dynamics were neither punitive nor celebratory, they were simply the aftermath of drawing clear boundaries. Evenings were the hardest. Clara asleep, the apartment silent except for the hum of the fridge and the occasional distant traffic, I sometimes felt the weight of the isolation that came with autonomy. But then I remembered the small victories: a calm, secure home, routines maintained, a niece safe and thriving, friends and allies steadfast. Slowly, I realized this quiet triumph was not hollow, it was earned. It was real. By the end of the week, I began mapping out the practical next steps: financial adjustments, minor home improvements, and, importantly, the ongoing care and nurturing of relationships that were mutual, chosen, and sustaining. I realized that rebuilding wasn't about grand gestures or revenge. It was about quiet, steady restoration, piece by piece, choice by choice. And in that quiet, deliberate work, I felt a new rhythm emerging, a life guided by boundaries, clarity, and intentional love. The family fracturing, the gossip, the financial blips, all were part of the aftermath, unavoidable but manageable. What mattered was that I had survived, preserved what I valued most, and begun to shape a life that no one could manipulate or diminish. Victory, I realized, was not a shout. It was the soft click of a lock securing a door. It was the rhythm of small joys, routines maintained, and the steady knowledge that we were safe, together, and finally, in control of our own lives. The mornings grew lighter, the apartment filled with the ordinary hum of life. Clara and I developed small routines that anchored us: breakfast at exactly the same time, walks to the nearby park, afternoons of drawing or reading. Nothing extraordinary, nothing performative, just the steady rhythm of a life rebuilt on choice rather than obligation. I realized, slowly, that this was the real triumph: ordinariness reclaimed, untainted by the expectations or manipulations of others. I began to invest in the life I had deliberately chosen. I joined a book club, a small circle of people who showed up reliably, who celebrated without judgment and never demanded more than I could give. Work became a sanctuary. I organized my schedule to allow for both professional focus and personal presence. I discovered that stability itself could feel like rebellion after years of chaos and imposed expectations. There were small celebrations, too. Clara's achievements, from school projects to minor milestones, became opportunities for genuine joy rather than tokens in a family ledger. We marked birthdays with homemade cakes and carefully chosen gifts that reflected attention, not tradition. I learned to appreciate these quiet ceremonies: the laughter, the shared meals, the sense of home that was ours alone. Even my home reflected the shift. I added plants to brighten corners, rearranged furniture to invite conversation and comfort, and created spaces for privacy and reflection. Each adjustment was subtle but intentional, a physical manifestation of autonomy. Every object, every small change was a testament to boundaries respected and life reassembled. I nurtured friendships with care. Some old acquaintances faded, their loyalty conditional and unreliable. But new bonds emerged, founded on reciprocity, presence, and shared values. I learned to identify energy that nourished rather than drained, and to invest fully in relationships that sustained both Clara and me. These connections became a network of quiet strength, reinforcing the lessons of recent months. That loyalty is earned, not assumed, love is chosen, not demanded. Work and personal projects flourished in ways they hadn't before. Freed from the weight of familial expectation, I approached tasks with focus and creativity. I completed long-delayed assignments, took on projects I had previously avoided, and felt the steady satisfaction of competence recognized on its own merit rather than measured against someone else's standards. Evenings became my favorite time. Dinner, a short walk, and then a shared quiet with Clara. Stories were read, sketches compared, homework done. The air carried no tension, only presence. I sometimes reflected on the months of preparation, confrontation, and documentation that had led us here. The effort, the vigilance, the careful rebellion, it had all been necessary to arrive at this unremarkable, extraordinary peace. Rebuilding was not cinematic. There were no dramatic proclamations or symbolic gestures. It was subtle, daily, intentional work, boundaries maintained, routines respected, joy quietly reclaimed. Each day added a brick to the life I was constructing, steady, resilient, and ours. And slowly, with patience and practice, I realized the deepest truth of rebuilding. The life I had fought to protect was now a life worth living. Not for anyone else's approval, not for family obligations, but for us. For the joy of small moments, the laughter, the calm certainty that our home and our lives were ours alone to shape and nurture. I watched her from the window, Clara laughing with her friends in the park, the sunlight catching her hair in golden strands. She had grown in the months since the confrontation, blossoming into a confident, independent little force of nature. Every small victory she achieved, every joy she embraced, felt like my own. I had protected her, guided her, and in doing so, safeguarded the essence of what mattered most to me. It wasn't about punishing my family. The old patterns, the manipulations, the entitled demands, they were still there, sure, but they no longer had a hold on us. My triumph wasn't cinematic. It didn't require public validation or dramatic confrontation. It was quieter, more profound, a life unshaken, a home safe, a child thriving. That was victory enough. I thought back to all the months of preparation, the meticulous documentation, the rehearsed conversations, the careful network of allies. Every small act had culminated in this, an existence that could not be manipulated, diminished, or coerced. The weight of old guilt, the reflexive need to appease, had been replaced by deliberate choice. Every boundary I had drawn was a brick in the fortress of our peace. Inside, I felt an unusual calm. There were no celebrations, no announcements. Just the steady hum of life lived deliberately. I had rebuilt not just the routines of our home, but the rhythm of my own heart, synchronized now with safety, love, and dignity. The quiet triumph was this, that I had stopped shrinking, that I had insisted on space to live fully, without apology, and that in doing so, I had created a sanctuary for Clara. Later, when she returned home, cheeks flushed from play and eyes bright with curiosity, I greeted her with a hug that was both ordinary and profound. "How was the park?" I asked, and she launched into a story, unaware of the inner battles her laughter and confidence now represented. I listened, fully present, aware of every small detail, every spontaneous gesture that testified to her flourishing. I realized then that peace had a texture, subtle but tangible. It was in the quiet moments, the routines honored, the boundaries respected. It was in the knowledge that we were safe, together, and capable. The cost had been high, the anxiety, the confrontation, the painstaking preparation, but the reward was life lived fully, without the shadow of manipulation or expectation. And as the sun dipped lower, casting long, gentle shadows across the apartment, I understood something fundamental. The real triumph isn't in revenge or spectacle. It's in refusing to be diminished. It's in creating a life where love and care are chosen freely, where joy is cultivated deliberately, and where the people you protect can grow without fear. I had done it. Not with drama, not with spectacle, but with patience, clarity, and quiet courage. And as I watched Clara's small hand reach for mine, I felt the depth of our shared triumph. This was ours. Fully, quietly, indelibly ours. For years had passed since the confrontation, for years in which life had settled into a rhythm both ordinary and extraordinary. The apartment was filled with laughter, books stacked in cozy corners, and the soft hum of routines that Clara and I had built together. Boundaries held firm. Invitations from family members came rarely, and when they did, I assessed each one carefully, choosing only what aligned with our peace. Clara had grown into a spirited, confident young girl. She moved through the world with curiosity and joy, unshadowed by past tensions or expectations. School achievements, friendships nurtured, small victories celebrated, these were the markers of our shared life. Every bedtime story, every shared meal, every ordinary moment carried with it the quiet triumph of freedom and care. I had cultivated friendships that were steady, reciprocal, and sustaining. Weekend visits with close friends, quiet dinners, and shared projects became the framework of my social life. Colleagues who had once been casual acquaintances were now steadfast allies, people who showed up and invested in honesty and presence rather than obligation. I discovered that family, in its truest sense, was not determined by blood or shared history, but by the people who actually showed up. Professionally, I thrived. Freed from the weight of my family's manipulations and demands, I could dedicate attention and energy to work I valued. Projects that had languished for years were completed, and small recognitions of competence came naturally, without compromise or self-effacement. There was satisfaction in knowing that my life had been rebuilt deliberately, thoughtfully, and on terms that honored both my values and my independence. Holidays and birthdays became rituals of intention rather than obligation. One birthday in particular stands out. A small gathering with friends and chosen family, laughter spilling across the kitchen, candles flickering, Clara proudly presenting her handmade gift. There was no performative grandeur, no expectation of approval, only presence, love, and deliberate joy. For the first time, celebrations were ours, fully, quietly, deliberately ours. I thought occasionally of the family I had distanced myself from. There were letters and messages, some attempts at reconciliation, most respectfully declined. I realized that peace didn't require severing connections, but it did demand boundaries. I had learned that one could care without complying, love without yielding, and maintain dignity without submission. Even in quiet moments alone, I felt the profound satisfaction of having built a life that could not be shaken by entitlement, manipulation, or expectation. Every document, every boundary, every deliberate act of care and preparation had culminated in this, a life that was ours, chosen and protected. I had learned the truest definition of family: the people who show up, the people who care without coercion, the people whose presence nurtures rather than diminishes. And in that definition, I found contentment. Looking out the window at Clara laughing in the fading light, I realized that the quiet, deliberate work of the last 4 years had created a home, a life, and a sense of belonging that was utterly real and wholly ours. I had not shrunk, I had not yielded, and I had learned that the life worth living was the one I had chosen. The boundaries I had set, the rituals I had built, the people I had welcomed, these were the pillars of a different kind of family. One that showed up, one that loved deliberately, one that let us flourish, fully, quietly, and without compromise. And for the first time in my life, I understood. That was enough.